90-year-old veteran bullied by bikers until he makes a shocking phone call. They thought he was just another old man. They were dead wrong. When a ruthless biker gang rolled into town, they thought it would be easy. They thought a 90-year-old veteran was nothing more than a frail, helpless relic of the past, someone they could intimidate, push around, make an example of. But what they didn't know, this man wasn't just some retired soldier. He was a legend, a war hero who had survived the impossible, seen the worst of humanity, and come out stronger. And when the gang crossed the line, when they laid hands on him, he made one phone call, a single call. And what happened next would go down in history, because within hours the streets were flooded, not with police, not with government forces, but with his brothers in arms. Veterans, men who had fought beside him on battlefields across the world, men who owed him their lives, and were ready to settle the score. What started as a day of bullying would end in a reckoning the gang never saw coming. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the town would never be the same again. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't forget. The old man sat at the corner of Jim's Gas and Go, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, the scent of fresh fuel mixing with the crisp Montana morning air. Walt Reynolds had lived in Brookdale for over 60 years, watching the town grow from a quiet settlement into a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone. He had been around long enough to see trouble come and go, long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The way people walked a little faster, the way the local shop owners glanced over their shoulders, the way fear had started creeping into the town's routine. Something was changing, and Walt didn't like it. At 90 years old, Walt wasn't just another old man. He had the scars to prove it. Scars from a time when his hands had gripped the cold steel of a rifle instead of a coffee cup. Scars from a time when every sunrise wasn't guaranteed. Back in 1951, he had stood knee-deep in the frozen hell of Korea, his unit cut off from supplies, surrounded by enemies in the brutal cold. He had seen men freeze to death where they stood, had carried wounded soldiers across blood-stained snow, had fought against odds so impossible that even now, all these years later, people didn't believe his stories. And maybe that was why people underestimated him. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet morning air. At first, it was distant, a faint vibration under the soles of his boots, but it grew louder, the kind of deep rolling thunder that made people instinctively stop what they were doing and look up. Walt set his coffee down and glanced toward the road, his weathered blue eyes narrowing. Then they appeared, a long line of chrome and leather, engines snarling like wild animals, the riders draped in black, their jackets covered in jagged skull insignias. They moved through town like they owned it, like they had already claimed it, their presence sending a clear message. Walt had seen this kind of trouble before. The locals immediately took notice. A man at the gas pump quickly closed his fuel cap and got into his truck. A mother pulled her young son closer, her eyes darting toward the bikers as she hurried toward her car. The cashier inside the gas station, a kid no older than 20, froze with a stack of bills in his hand, staring out the window. Walt exhaled slowly. Brookdale had never been the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. It wasn't the kind of town where men like these could ride in and start making demands. But it was clear from the way they rode, the way they slowed down just enough to make their presence known, that they had plans for Brookdale. The leader rode at the front, a massive man, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His black sunglasses hid his eyes, but Walt could tell, even from across the street, that he was looking directly at him. The gang came to a slow stop in the lot of Jim's Gas and Go, parking their bikes in a loose formation. The leader, who Walt would later learn was called Havoc, swung off his motorcycle with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing people were afraid of him. He stretched, cracked his knuckles, and smirked as his gang spread out like a pack of wolves, sniffing new territory. "Nice little town," Havoc muttered, his voice low and gravelly, like a man who had smoked more than he had spoken in his lifetime. His men chuckled, some of them kicking at loose gravel, some of them scanning the storefronts with expressions that weren't curiosity. It was calculation. Walt knew that look. They weren't just passing through. They were measuring Brookdale, testing it, deciding whether it was worth taking. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the people around him sank into silence, pretending not to notice, hoping they'd be ignored. But Walt had never been the kind of man to sit quietly while wolves prowled at the edge of his town. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. Havoc turned, finally taking his sunglasses off, revealing cold, predatory eyes. He smirked when he saw Walt still sitting there, unmoved, unfazed. "Look at this guy," one of the bikers sneered, elbowing his buddy. "Not even a little scared." Walt leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Son, I've met men a lot scarier than you, and they didn't have to rev their engines to prove it." The laughter stopped. For the first time, an actual silence fell over the group. The gang was used to people being afraid. They were used to people backing down, looking away, avoiding confrontation. But Walt wasn't backing down. He had seen real monsters before. He had faced the kind of men who didn't give second chances. And the men standing in front of him? They weren't monsters. They were boys playing dress-up. Havoc's smirk faded just slightly. "What's your name, old man?" he asked, stepping closer. Walt picked up his coffee again, took another sip, and gave the same answer he had given countless times on the battlefield, when enemy soldiers asked for his name before he pulled the trigger. "You don't need to know my name, son. You just need to know that you won't like what happens if you push me." There was a long pause. Then Havoc chuckled, low and amused, but there was something forced about it now. "That's so. That's so." The gang snickered, but there was an uncertainty in their eyes now, like they weren't sure if this was a joke anymore. Walt took another sip, calm as ever. Havoc leaned in closer. "You've got a lot of mouth for an old man." Walt met his gaze, unflinching. "And you've got a lot of men for someone who isn't afraid." The words hung between them. Then, slowly, Havoc stepped back, his smirk returning, but Walt could see the tension in his jaw now. "We'll be seeing you around, Grandpa." Walt simply nodded. The gang mounted their bikes, revving their engines one last time before peeling out of the gas station, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. The town breathed again, but Walt knew it wasn't over. Because men like that, they didn't like being challenged. And when they came back, they wouldn't just be looking to take over the town. They'd be coming to teach him a lesson. But what they didn't know was that Walt Reynolds wasn't just some old man sitting at a gas station. He was a man with history, a man with friends in places they would never expect. And when they came back, they would be the ones learning a lesson. Walt could still feel the rumble in his chest long after the motorcycles had disappeared down Main Street, their echoing growls bouncing off the quiet buildings of Brookdale. The tension in the air had settled, but not completely. People were still on edge, their eyes shifting toward one another, their whispered conversations filled with uncertainty. He had seen it before. The slow creep of fear. It started small, like a ripple in a pond. A few uneasy glances, a couple of nervous conversations behind closed doors. Then it grew. People stopped walking alone at night. Businesses closed earlier than usual. The town began to shrink, not in size but in spirit. And he knew exactly where that road led. Walt had lived through war, had seen what fear did to men. Fear made people hesitate, made them doubt themselves, made them give in. And when that happened, when fear took hold, the people who thrived on control, men like Havoc, won without ever having to fight. As he picked up his coffee, he noticed Jim, the gas station owner, standing just inside the glass door, his arms crossed. Jim had been running this place for almost 30 years, ever since he'd inherited it from his father. He had seen everything Brookdale had to offer, the good and the bad. But today, there was something in his expression Walt didn't like. Walt set down his cup and motioned him over. Jim hesitated, glancing around before stepping outside, his boots scuffing against the worn pavement. "You feel that?" Walt asked, his voice steady. Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I do." "They're not just passing through," Walt said, watching the last traces of dust settle on the road. "They're testing the town." Jim nodded slowly. "They've been hanging around the outskirts for a couple of weeks now. Few of them came in last weekend, asking questions at the diner. At first I thought they were just troublemakers looking for a place to drink. But this," he exhaled sharply, "this is different." Walt watched a few locals step out of their shops, cautious, wary, scanning the street like they expected something to happen. A woman hurried across the parking lot, pulling her child along, throwing nervous glances over her shoulder. "They're afraid," Walt said. Jim sighed again. "Wouldn't you be? These guys, they ain't like the usual rowdy bikers passing through. They look like they've got a plan, and towns like ours, we don't got the numbers to stop 'em." Walt's grip tightened slightly on his coffee cup. The problem with men like Havoc and his gang was that they didn't just take over with violence. They didn't storm into town waving guns and making demands. Number. They were smarter than that. First, they made themselves a problem. Then, they made themselves the only solution. It always started the same way: intimidation, pressure, a few broken windows or stolen goods here and there. Then they offered protection, not in the way a sheriff did, but in the way a pack of wolves protected a herd of sheep. And little by little, town by town, they built an empire out of fear. He had seen it before, and if they thought Brookdale would fall like the others, they were in for a rude awakening. Jim shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Walt, I respect you. Everyone in town does. But this ain't Korea. You're not a soldier anymore. These guys, they don't care about what you did back then. And we—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "We can't fight them." Walt didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Then he placed the cup down, his movements measured and deliberate. "That's where you're wrong, Jim," he said quietly. "I never stopped being a soldier. I just haven't had a war to fight in a while." Jim opened his mouth as if to argue, but stopped. Walt's eyes were different now. It wasn't the look of a frail old man sitting on a porch reminiscing about the past. It was the look of a man who had stood in the middle of gunfire, watched his friends die, and survived against all odds. Jim swallowed hard. "What are you going to do?" Walt leaned back in his chair. "For now, I wait." Jim frowned. "For what?" Walt smirked. "For them to make their next move, because they will. And when they do, they won't like what happens next." Jim exhaled through his nose, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off the weight of the conversation. "You really think we can stop 'em?" Walt studied the street. It was still the same Brookdale he had known for years, but now it felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. But walls could be broken down just as easily as they could be rebuilt. "Jim, let me tell you something about bullies," Walt said. "They're only as strong as the fear people give 'em. You take that fear away and they're nothing." Jim gave a weak chuckle. "Not sure the town's ready to fight." "Then they'll have to learn," Walt said simply. And they would, because the Black Vipers weren't done with Brookdale, and neither was he. Across town, in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Brookdale, Havoc sat in a booth, his injured wrist wrapped in ice, his jaw clenched tight. The gang was buzzing with laughter and confidence, slapping each other's backs, ordering drinks, acting as if they had already won. But Havoc wasn't smiling. He kept replaying the morning in his mind. That old man, he should have backed down. He should have been terrified. Instead, he had looked at Havoc like he was just another street punk, like he was nothing special. And Havoc hated that. T-Rex, the brute who had first shoved Walt at the gas station, leaned against the booth. "What's the plan, boss? This town's ripe for the taking." Havoc rolled his injured wrist, eyes narrowed. "We teach that old man a lesson first," he growled. "Then we take Brookdale." T-Rex grinned. You want me to rough him up a little?" Havoc's lip curled into a cold smile. "No," he said. "I want him to wish he never crossed us." The laughter in the bar grew louder. Across town, Walt sat quietly on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He knew what was coming. He knew they were going to come for him first. And when they did, when they came looking for a fight, they were going to get one. The night air in Brookdale was thick with silence, the kind of silence that sat heavy on a man's chest. Walt Reynolds sat on his wooden porch, his chair creaking beneath him as he listened to the wind move through the trees. He had felt this before. Back in Korea, before an ambush, there was always a moment of silence, a moment where everything in the world seemed to hold its breath before hell broke loose. This was that moment. He could sense them, the black vipers. They were out there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting for their moment to strike. They thought they had the advantage. They thought they could scare him. They thought he was just an old man sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. But Walt wasn't alone. He had more ghosts at his back than they could ever count. And he wasn't scared. The sound of motorcycles in the distance sent a ripple through the quiet night. Not the steady, relaxed hum of a group riding through town, but something different. The engines were revving too hard, too erratic. They weren't just passing through. They were coming for him. Walt took one last sip of his coffee, set it down on the worn wooden railing, and stood up. His old knees ached, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He reached behind the door and pulled out an old wooden baseball bat, running his fingers along the smooth, familiar surface. He had never been one for guns, not unless he had to be. And right now, he didn't have to be. A single headlight appeared in the distance, then another, and another. Soon, the dirt road leading to Walt's house was lined with bikes, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. The gang wasn't just here to scare him. They were here to send a message. Walt stepped down from his porch, the bat hanging loosely in his hand. He walked to the middle of his gravel driveway and stood there, waiting, his breath slow and measured. The lead bike skidded to a stop, kicking up dust and gravel. Havoc sat on it, his injured wrist still wrapped, his dark eyes full of violence. The others pulled up beside him, forming a loose half-circle around Walt's property, their engines growling like caged animals. Havoc swung off his bike and took a slow step forward. "Evening, old man." Walt didn't blink. "You're trespassing." Havoc chuckled, shaking his head. "You got a real smart mouth for someone standing alone." Walt's grip tightened on the bat. "I've been standing alone a long time, son. You don't scare me." The gang laughed, some of them shaking their heads in amusement. Havoc cracked his knuckles. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Reynolds. You think what happened at the gas station was funny. Think it was smart, embarrassing me in front of my guys." Walt tilted his head. "You embarrassed yourself, son. You let an old man get under your skin." The laughter stopped. Havoc's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He took another step closer, now only a few feet from Walt. "You think you're some kind of legend, huh? War hero, big man, still got some fight left in you?" he sneered. "I've put tougher men in the dirt for less." Walt didn't flinch. "You ain't put anyone in the dirt, kid. You just play at being a tough guy. But you've never faced real men before. You've never fought for something that actually mattered." For a second, just a second, Havoc's mask cracked. Walt saw it. That little flicker of doubt. The second-guessing. The part of him that knew he wasn't a real warrior, just a man pretending to be one. But it disappeared just as fast. Havoc's fist shot forward without warning, aiming straight for Walt's face. But Walt had been expecting it. With reflexes faster than anyone thought possible for a man his age, Walt took one sidestep, dodging the punch completely. And then, crack! The baseball bat slammed into Havoc's ribs, sending him stumbling back, gasping for breath. The gang went dead silent as their leader crumpled to one knee, his hand clutching his side. No one moved. No one had expected it. Not them, not Havoc. But Walt had, because men like Havoc always underestimated the wrong people. Walt stood over him, his voice low and even. "You come to my home, threaten me, thinking I'll roll over and be scared of you." He shook his head. "I've seen better men than you die crying in the dirt. You ain't special." Havoc's breaths were ragged, his face contorted in pure hatred. He tried to stand, but his ribs screamed in protest. Walt leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go home, boy, while you still can." The gang stood frozen, watching, waiting for a command from their leader. Havoc glared at Walt, seething. Then, with a snarl, he shoved himself to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. "This ain't over," he spat. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Walt nodded, his grip still tight on the bat. "I hear that a lot," he said. Havoc turned to his gang, his pride still wounded, his body still aching. He swung a leg over his bike, revved the engine, and peeled out onto the road, sending a shower of gravel into the night. One by one, the others followed him, some glancing back at Walt, some not meeting his gaze at all. The sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. Walt stood there for a long moment, feeling the bruises on his hands, the ache in his shoulders. They weren't done. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't just come for him. They'd come for the town. And that was just fine, because Walt Reynolds was ready. The next morning, the town of Brookdale woke up to something different. Word had already spread before the sun even rose. By the time Walt Reynolds stepped out onto his porch, he could feel the weight of the eyes on him. Across the street, his neighbor, Bill Carson, was pretending to fix his mailbox, but he was really just watching. Down the road, Mrs. Hendricks, who usually only left her house for groceries and church, was outside on her porch, shaking her head like she had seen a ghost. Everyone in town knew what had happened the night before. Everyone had heard, and just like that, a shift had begun. Brookdale wasn't the kind of town that dealt with gangs and violence. It was the kind of town where people trusted their neighbors, where kids rode their bikes down Main Street without worry, where folks left their doors unlocked at night. At least it used to be. But now? Now, people were worried. They had seen what the Black Vipers were capable of. They had seen how easily they had claimed territory in other towns. And they knew one thing for certain. They weren't done with Brookdale yet. That's why people kept their heads down. That's why no one was saying anything out loud. Fear had dug its claws into the town, and once fear took hold, it was damn near impossible to shake off. Walt could see it in their faces. They were waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if he would pay the price for standing up to the gang, waiting to see if Brookdale was about to become another forgotten town under the Vipers' rule. But Walt wasn't about to let that happen. Not today, not ever. With slow, steady movements, he walked down the creaky steps of his porch, past the old oak tree that had been growing since the day he bought this land, and toward his trusty Dodge pickup. He wasn't waiting for trouble. He was going to it. The diner was quieter than usual. Not empty, just quiet. People were there, eating their breakfast, drinking their coffee, but conversations were hushed. The usual morning laughter was missing. The usual friendly waves weren't exchanged. People were nervous, and Walt knew why. The moment he stepped inside, every eye in the place turned to him. He could feel them watching, some with worry, some with curiosity, and some with something else entirely. Respect, because whether they were ready to say it out loud or not, he had done something none of them had. He had stood up to the Vipers, and he was still here. That meant something. Walt didn't say a word as he walked to his usual booth near the window. Diana, the owner of the diner, was already pouring his coffee before he even sat down. "You're up early," she said, sliding the cup in front of him. "Been up," Walt replied, taking a sip. Diana hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the other customers before lowering her voice. "I heard what happened." "I figured." She folded her arms, leaning against the counter. "They're coming back, aren't they?" "Yep." Diana's jaw tightened. "And you're gonna stand against them?" Walt looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what she wasn't saying out loud. She was afraid, But she was also angry, because this was her town too, because she had built this diner from nothing, spent 20 years serving meals to the same people who were now afraid to even walk outside their doors, because she was tired of pretending everything would be okay if they just stayed quiet. So Walt gave her the only answer that mattered. "They're not taking this town," he said, "not while I'm still breathing." Diana exhaled slowly, nodding. Then, without another word, she walked back behind the counter. Jim, the owner of the gas station, showed up at Walt's booth a few minutes later, hat in hand, looking uneasy. "Mind if I sit?" Walt motioned toward the empty seat. "Go ahead." Jim slid in, wringing his hands together like he was working up the nerve to say something. "You know, he cleared his throat. "We all saw what happened last night." "I figured." Jim sighed. "Look, I ain't no coward, all right? But you know as well as I do, these guys don't just give up. You hit 'em, they hit back harder. That's how gangs work." "They're not gangsters," Walt said, shaking his head. "They're just punks who've never been hit hard enough." Jim swallowed. "Still, I got a family, got a business, and I don't know if standing up to these guys is worth losing all that." Walt studied him for a long moment. Jim was a good man, always had been, but fear was a powerful thing, and Jim, like a lot of folks in town, had been living under it for too long. "You know what happens if we do nothing?" Walt asked. Jim didn't answer. "They take this town," Walt continued. "They start small. They lean on business owners, make 'em pay for protection. They let people think it's just a little money, just a small price to keep their families safe." Jim shifted uncomfortably. "Then they start picking fights," Walt went on. "Anyone who doesn't fall in line gets a warning. A smashed window, a slashed tire, maybe worse. They get people so afraid of standing up to them, they never have to actually do anything." Jim exhaled, rubbing his hands together again. "That's how it happens," Walt said, "and once it does, it's already too late." Jim nodded slowly, eyes distant. He had seen what happened to towns that let the wrong people in, and now he had to decide. Did he want to live in fear, or did he want to fight for his town? Walt didn't push him, he just let him sit with it. After a long pause, Jim finally looked up. "You got a plan?" Walt smirked. "Yeah," he said, "I got a plan." Jim nodded, then stood. "All right," he muttered. "I'm in." And just like that, the first piece fell into place. Walt watched as Jim left, then took another slow sip of his coffee. The Vipers were coming back. They thought Brookdale was going to roll over and hand them the keys. They thought they had already won. But they didn't realize something. This town, it wasn't afraid anymore, and that meant they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The wind rolled through Brookdale that afternoon, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain and cut grass. But beneath the familiar comfort of small-town life, there was something else. Tension. It was an invisible weight that sat on every shoulder, creeping into conversations, turning everyday routines into something fragile, like a glass just waiting to shatter. Walt Reynolds knew that feeling well. He had felt it in Korea before a firefight. He had felt it in the trenches, when the silence stretched too long, when the world went still, and you just knew something was coming. And something was coming. The Black Vipers were still licking their wounds, still seething after what had happened the night before. Havoc was the kind of man who thrived on dominance, and Walt had made him look weak. That wasn't something a man like Havoc could tolerate. So they were coming back, but this time they weren't coming for a warning. Walt spent most of the afternoon working in his shed, sorting through old tools and rusted parts that had been sitting there for far too long. A lot of people made the mistake of thinking war was about firepower, that whoever had the biggest weapons won. But that wasn't how it worked. War was about preparation, about who knew the terrain better, about who could outthink the other side before the first shot was ever fired. And Walt had been preparing for war his entire life. He unlatched an old wooden crate at the back of the shed and opened it. Inside, nestled beneath a thick army blanket, was a collection of memories from a time before Brookdale, a time before peace. He reached down, pulling out a K-bar combat knife, the handle worn smooth from decades of use. He set it aside. Then came an old M1 Garand, still oiled, still clean, still just as deadly as the day he had carried it across frozen battlefields. He wouldn't need it, not yet. Instead, he reached for something else, a length of thick steel chain, heavy in his hands. A man didn't need bullets to send a message. Sometimes all you needed was the right kind of lesson. Jim wasn't the only one who had approached Walt at the diner that morning. Word had spread, and with it, something even more important than fear, hope. Because when one man stands up, it reminds others that they don't have to kneel. By sunset, a dozen men had gathered at Walt's property, their trucks parked haphazardly in the gravel, their faces hard with quiet determination. Some were farmers, some were mechanics, some were just regular men who had built their lives in Brookdale and weren't about to let a gang of out-of-town punks tear it all down. They weren't warriors, but they were tired of being afraid, and that was more dangerous than any weapon. Walt stood on his porch, the weight of their gazes on him, waiting for him to tell them what to do. "You all know why you're here," Walt finally said, his voice low and steady. "So I won't waste time with speeches. The Vipers are coming back. They're coming to remind us that they think this town belongs to them, that we're just supposed to sit back and let them take what they want." A murmur passed through the group. Some nodded, some clenched their fists. Walt let the words settle before continuing. "But they made a mistake," he said. "They let us see that they can bleed." Jim, standing near the front, swallowed hard. "You really think we can stop them?" Walt nodded. "I know we can, because they're not expecting this. They're expecting fear. They're expecting hesitation. What they're not expecting is a town that's willing to fight back." A silence followed, then a single voice from the crowd. "Tell us what to do." The plan was simple. The Vipers thrived on intimidation, on making people feel like they had no choice but to give in. That was how they had taken the last town. That was how they had taken the one before it. But Brookdale wasn't going to be like the others. That night, as the town settled into uneasy silence, Walt and the others went to work. They reinforced doors and windows at every business that had been threatened. They set up motion-triggered floodlights around key locations, the diner, the gas station, the grocery store, places the Vipers were likely to target first. And at every major intersection leading into town, they left a warning. Heavy chains wrapped around wooden posts, steel spikes embedded in the road, barriers made from old truck parts and stacked cinder blocks. It wasn't a wall, it was a message. At midnight, they came. A dozen bikes at first, roaring through the dark, their headlights slashing through the misty night air. They slowed as they reached the edge of town, and that's when they saw it. The first blockade. A row of old farm equipment and heavy debris blocking the main road, placed so perfectly that they couldn't simply go around it. They revved their engines, unsure. Then one of them, a younger guy who still thought he was invincible, gunned his engine and tried to weave through. His tire met a spike strip. The hiss of escaping air filled the night as the bike lurched forward, the rider barely managing to steady himself before slamming the brakes. The others stopped, silent now. The leader of this group, T-Rex, one of Havoc's top guys, swore under his breath, "This ain't good." The others were already looking around, uneasy. This was supposed to be easy. They were supposed to roll into town, make an example out of Reynolds, remind the town who really ran things. But now it looked like Brookdale had been expecting them, and more than that, Brookdale was ready. From a rooftop nearby, Walt watched through the scope of an old pair of binoculars, his breath slow and even. They had stopped. They were hesitating. Good. Let them. He didn't want a war, but if they chose one, he would give them one. The night stretched on, thick with tension, and then, just like that, the Vipers turned their bikes around and rode away. Walt lowered the binoculars, watching as their taillights faded into the darkness. They weren't giving up. They were recalculating. Down the street, Jim exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, that was easier than I thought." Walt shook his head. "No, it wasn't. That was just the first play." Jim frowned. "You think they'll come back?" Walt's grip tightened on the binoculars. "Oh, they'll be back," he said. "But next time, they won't stop at the barricades." Jim swallowed. "So, what do we do?" Walt exhaled, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. "We make sure that when they do come back, we're ready to end this." The morning sun barely touched the rooftops of Brookdale before word had already spread. The Black Vipers had backed off. For the first time in months, they had arrived in town and left without getting what they wanted. But Walt Reynolds knew better than to think it was over. The Vipers weren't the kind of men who took a step back. They were the kind of men who came back with twice the force. That's why Walt wasn't celebrating. He was waiting, and he wasn't the only one. Jim was already at the gas station, checking the locks and making sure the security cameras were running. Diana had a baseball bat stashed behind the counter of the diner. The people of Brookdale were tired of waiting for trouble to come to them. For the first time since this whole thing had started, they were preparing to fight back, and that, more than anything, was what would make the difference. Across town, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, havoc was seething. The bruises from his encounter with Walt still ached, but that wasn't what burned him. It was the humiliation. It was the fact that an old man had made him look weak in front of his men. Havoc sat at a makeshift table, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. T-Rex stood in front of him, looking uncomfortable, as if he knew what was coming. "You're telling me," Havoc growled, voice low and dangerous, "that we sent 12 guys into Brookdale, and not only did they turn around, but they ran like scared children." T-Rex shifted uncomfortably, not meeting Havoc's gaze. "It wasn't like that. They were ready for us, like really ready. Blockades, spike strips, they knew we were coming." Havoc clenched his teeth. "You think some bunch of farmers and gas station clerks put that together overnight?" T-Rex swallowed. "Number, this was Reynolds. He's leading this whole thing." Havoc pushed himself up from the table. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, making everyone in the room tense. "I don't give a damn if he's George Washington himself," he snapped. "I want him broken." T-Rex hesitated, then muttered, "The men are getting nervous, Havoc." Havoc's head snapped toward him. "What did you just say?" T-Rex exhaled. "They're saying maybe Brookdale ain't worth it. Maybe we just move on, pick an easier town." The room went silent. Then, crack. Havoc's fist collided with T-Rex's jaw, sending the bigger man stumbling backward into a pile of rusted metal. T-Rex clutched his face, blood running from his nose, but he didn't fight back, because he knew what happened to people who did. Havoc leaned down, his voice dangerously calm. "We're not leaving until Reynolds and his little army of nobodies beg me for mercy. You understand?" T-Rex wiped the blood from his nose and nodded. "Good," Havoc muttered, rolling his injured wrist before turning to the rest of the gang. "If they want to fight like a military, then we treat this like war. No more games, no more warnings. Tonight, we hit 'em where it hurts." The men murmured in agreement, but it was clear they weren't just following orders. They were angry now, because the Black Vipers weren't just about control, they were about fear. And last night, they had been the ones who were afraid. Havoc wasn't going to let that stand. Brookdale was about to learn what happened to towns that pushed back. Back at Walt's place, a small group had gathered around the old oak tree in his yard, the same place where his father had once built a tire swing for him when he was just a boy. Now, the men who stood beneath it weren't playing. They were getting ready for war. Jim, still a little nervous, rubbed the back of his neck. "So what's the plan, Walt? They're coming back, that's for damn sure. And if last night proved anything, it's that they're pissed." "They are," Walt agreed, "and that's good." Jim frowned. "Good?" Walt nodded. "Because angry men make stupid mistakes." Some of the others, mostly younger guys who had never been in a real fight before, shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a mechanic named Ryan, muttered, "Yeah, well, what if those stupid mistakes cost us?" Walt turned to look at him. "If we sit back and do nothing, we lose anyway." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. Walt took a deep breath. "I'm not going to lie to any of you," he said, voice steady. "This isn't going to be easy. They'll hit back harder, and they'll try to make an example out of us. But we've got something they don't." Jim raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Walt smirked. "We've got the home field advantage." The preparations continued long after the sun set. At the gas station, Jim and two others were reinforcing the doors, making sure nothing short of a battering ram could get through. Down at the diner, Diana was arming the kitchen staff with anything they could use: knives, bats, even a few old shotguns that had been collecting dust in storage. And at Walt's place, the men were setting traps. Because this time, when the Vipers came, Brookdale wouldn't be caught off guard, they would be waiting, and they would be ready. At 1:14 a.m., the Black Vipers returned. Their engines rumbled like thunder as 20 bikes stormed toward Brookdale, followed by a black van, its cargo unknown. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this time the town was watching. From rooftops, from behind fences, from shadows. This time Brookdale wasn't the prey, they were the hunters. And when the first bike crossed the town line, the trap was sprung. T-Rex barely had time to react before his front tire hit a hidden metal cable stretched across the road. The bike flipped violently, sending him crashing into the pavement, rolling twice before coming to a stop. The others skidded to a halt, looking around in confusion. Then, bang! A floodlight snapped on, blinding them. From the rooftops, from the alleyways, from the doors that had been locked shut just days ago, Brookdale stepped out of the shadows. Armed, prepared, unafraid. Havoc's heart pounded as he looked around, realizing too late. Brookdale wasn't just fighting back. They were winning, and for the first time since this started, he was the one who felt fear. The moment the trap snapped shut, everything changed. For weeks the Black Vipers had been the hunters, riding into town like they owned it, taking what they wanted, scaring whoever they pleased. But now they were the ones caught. The floodlights roared to life, turning night into day, blinding the gang members who had just stormed into Brookdale, thinking they'd find an easy fight. Havoc was the first to react, his boots scraping against the pavement as he ducked away from the blinding light. "Turn 'em off!" he barked, shielding his eyes. No one listened, because they were panicking. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to roll in, wreck the place, and send a message. Instead, it was their bikes hitting the ground, their men scrambling for cover, and their plan falling apart before it even started. T-Rex groaned, still sprawled out on the pavement from the hidden steel cable that had flipped his bike. Blood ran from his forehead, dripping onto the asphalt as he tried to push himself up. He had no idea where his gun was, or his knife, or even where his own damn bike had landed. All he knew was that he was on the ground, and that meant he was as good as dead if someone wanted to make an example out of him. The others weren't much better. One guy had hit a patch of oil Walt had poured across the street earlier that day, and now his bike was in a ditch, engine smoking. Another had tried to ride up onto the sidewalk, only to have his front tire slam into a wooden barrier that hadn't been there the day before. The Black Vipers were in chaos, and standing against them, from the rooftops, the alleyways, and the very streets they thought they owned, were the people of Brookdale. Armed, prepared, watching. Walt Reynolds stood in the center of the street, a heavy length of steel chain wrapped around his fist, his eyes locked on Havoc. The leader of the Black Vipers stared back at him, his breathing ragged, his knuckles cracking as he flexed his fingers. He wanted to charge, wanted to swing, wanted to break something just to remind himself that he was in control, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't. Jim stepped up beside Walt, gripping an old double-barrel shotgun, his knuckles white against the stock. "You still think this is your town?" Jim asked, his voice steady, but edged with something cold. Havoc's lips twisted into a snarl, his body tensed like a caged animal. "You don't know what you just started," he hissed. "You don't know who the hell you're messing with." "Yeah," Walt muttered. "We do." And then Brookdale moved. From the rooftops, men with rifles and spotlights took aim, their presence undeniable. From the alleyways, men holding metal pipes, baseball bats, and tire irons stepped forward. From the sidewalks, shop owners and farmers, fathers and brothers, all moved as one. Havoc had spent his life beating men into submission, making them bow before him. But Brookdale wasn't bowing. Brookdale was standing. "Last chance," Walt said, voice low and calm. "Walk away." Havoc spat on the ground. "You think you scared us? We'll be back. We'll burn this whole damn town to the ground." Behind Walt, Diana's voice rang out. "Then you'd better start digging your own graves now." Havoc's nostrils flared, his face darkening. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the Vipers turned around, got on his bike and rode off into the night. Then another, and another. The fear that had been gripping the town for weeks was now gripping the gang that had caused it. They were breaking, and Havoc felt it. His men were leaving him, just like that. He gritted his teeth so hard it hurt, his fingers twitching by his side. He could fight. He could throw the first punch, go out swinging, make an example of himself, or dash. He could wait, because there would be another time, another chance. Brookdale had made a mistake. They had let him live. With one last furious glare, Havoc turned and stalked toward his bike. He didn't say another word, didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledging defeat. He just revved the engine and tore off down the street, disappearing into the dark. A moment later, the last of the Vipers followed. And then, for the first time since all of this had started, Brookdale was quiet. Jim let out a long breath. "That's it?" he asked, almost not believing it. "They're just gonna leave?" "They'll be back," Walt muttered, unwrapping the chain from his hand. Jim swallowed hard. "So, what do we do now?" Walt exhaled. "We get ready," he said, "because next time, we end this." Brookdale was silent. Not the usual peaceful silence of a town settling in for the night, but a waiting silence. The kind that came before a storm, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made every small sound feel louder than it should be. People were still awake, peering through curtains, watching. The men of Brookdale, the ones who had stood up against the Vipers, hadn't gone home yet, because even though the gang had ridden out of town, they all knew it wasn't over. It was never that simple. Walt Reynolds sat on his porch, staring out at the dark streets, his hands folded in his lap, waiting. Because the worst thing you could ever do in a fight was think you'd already won. Jim sat beside him, shotgun resting across his knees, his fingers drumming against the wood. "They left too easy," he muttered. "That wasn't a real retreat. That was something else." Walt nodded. "They didn't leave," he said. "They regrouped." Jim swallowed. "So, what now?" Walt exhaled through his nose, his eyes still locked on the road ahead. "Now, we do what they're doing." Jim raised an eyebrow. "What, ride out of town and lick our wounds?" "No," Walt muttered. "We prepare for the next hit." Because it was coming. Havoc wasn't the kind of man who took a loss lightly. And tonight hadn't been a loss to him. It had been a lesson. He had seen what Brookdale was capable of, and next time he wouldn't be blindsided. Across town, inside Diana's diner, the rest of the Brookdale men were gathered, their faces hard and unreadable. Some were still gripping their weapons, knuckles white from the tension, unable to fully relax. Ryan, the mechanic, was pacing near the door, arms crossed. "They're gonna be back," he muttered, "and next time they'll bring more guys. They'll bring guns." No one argued, because he was right. Tom, the hardware store owner, leaned forward in his seat. "We're not fighters, Walt. You are. But most of us, we work on cars. We run stores. We plant fields." Walt looked at him. "And you think that means you can't fight?" Tom hesitated, but he didn't answer, because he already knew the truth. Fighting wasn't about being a soldier. It wasn't about knowing how to throw a punch or fire a gun. It was about knowing what was worth standing for. And everyone in that diner, they had something worth standing for. So Walt leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "We don't need to be warriors," he said. "We just need to be smarter than them." By dawn, Brookdale had already started to change. The barricades hadn't been taken down. They had been reinforced. The men who had once spent their mornings drinking coffee and reading the paper were now learning how to use radios, how to communicate, how to move together. The gas station had become a watchpost, with Jim and a few others keeping an eye on every car that came through town. The old barn behind Walt's house? It was now a weapons locker, stocked with everything from hunting rifles to thick wooden bats. And at every major entrance to Brookdale, there were eyes watching. Because next time, Brookdale wouldn't be reacting. They'd be ready before the first bike even hit town. Meanwhile, miles outside of town, the Black Vipers had gathered in an abandoned warehouse, plotting their return. Havoc's jaw was still aching, his fingers flexing against the rough wooden table as he stared at the men around him. T-Rex sat near the back, his face swollen from where he had hit the pavement the night before. He wasn't speaking, because he had failed. And Havoc wasn't in a forgiving mood. "We're gonna wipe that town off the damn map," he growled, his voice low and furious. The men around him shifted uneasily. The thing was, they weren't sure anymore. Brookdale had fought back, harder than any other town they had ever hit, and that made some of the Vipers nervous. One of them, a younger guy with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward. "Havoc, maybe we should—" Crack! Havoc's fist slammed into the table, making every man in the room jump. "You got something to say?" he snarled. Scar hesitated, then shook his head. That was good enough for now, because Havoc didn't need doubts. He needed revenge. Back in Brookdale, Walt stood outside his house watching the sun rise. His body ached. His hands were sore, but his mind, clear as ever, because he knew something Havoc didn't. The Black Vipers were just men. And men? They could be broken. The real fight was coming. The kind of fight that would end this once and for all. And this time, Brookdale wasn't the one who had to be afraid. For the first time in a long time, Brookdale felt like a town again. Not just a place where people lived, but a place where people stood together. Neighbors who once barely spoke were now working side by side. Shopkeepers, farmers, mechanics, people who never considered themselves fighters, were now preparing for battle. Because everyone knew the truth. The Black Vipers weren't done. They had been embarrassed, humiliated, pushed back. And men like Havoc, they didn't let that go. They festered, they planned, they came back worse. And when they did, Brookdale would be ready. Walt Reynolds stood at the town's southern entrance, arms folded, watching the horizon. It was quiet. Too quiet. That kind of quiet that made a man nervous. Beside him, Jim shifted his weight, the shotgun slung over his shoulder. "You ever just want to leave?" Jim muttered. Walt didn't look at him. "No." Jim exhaled. "Not even when you were younger?" Walt's eyes stayed locked on the road. "Leaving don't fix the problem, Jim." Jim scoffed. "Might make it someone else's problem." Walt finally turned to him, his stare hard and steady. "That's what men like Havoc do. They ride into a town, take what they want, and then when there's nothing left, they leave. I ain't running, Jim. Not from this." Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, didn't think you would." Across town, at the gas station, Ryan was checking the security feeds. They had installed cheap cameras all over town, hooked up to old laptops, whatever they could scrounge together. It wasn't high-tech, but it was better than nothing. Ryan sipped his coffee, frowning at the screen. Something felt off. The roads were too empty. For a town that had just fought off a gang of bikers, he expected more movement, more people checking in, more signs of life. But everything was still. That's when he saw it, a single truck. Coming in slow, no bikes, no headlights, just rolling in, like a shadow through the early morning mist. Ryan froze, staring at the screen, his gut clenched. Something wasn't right. He grabbed his radio, voice tight. Walt? You better get down here." At the southern entrance, Walt's radio crackled. He lifted it to his mouth, pressing the button. "What is it?" Ryan's voice came through, low and uneasy. "Got a truck coming in. Just one. No bikes." Walt's brow furrowed. "Plates?" "Can't see yet. It's moving slow. Too slow." That was all Walt needed to hear. "Get everyone on alert," he said. "Now." Jim had already lowered his shotgun, watching as Walt's expression hardened. "Trouble?" Jim asked. Walt didn't answer. He didn't have to. By the time the truck rolled into town, Brookdale was waiting. Not in the streets, not out in the open, but from the shadows, watching. The truck creaked to a stop in the middle of Main Street. Dust settled around its tires. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, not Havoc, not a Viper, someone else. He was tall, lean, too well dressed for a guy driving an old beater truck into a war zone. Dark suit, silver tie, black gloves. The kind of man who didn't belong in a place like Brookdale. Walt stepped out from the alleyway, approaching slow. Jim flanked him, shotgun at the ready. The man in the suit watched them approach, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "Mr. Reynolds," he said. His voice was smooth, calm, too calm. Walt didn't break stride. "You got business here?" The man tilted his head slightly. "You could say that." Jim tightened his grip on the shotgun. "You with the Vipers?" The man smiled, not friendly. "No," he said. "I'm above them." Walt stopped 10 feet away, eyes narrowing. "That's supposed to mean something to me." The man reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Walt didn't take it. The man chuckled. "Smart." He unfolded it himself, letting Walt see what was written. It was an address, not just any address. Walt's house. Underneath, in neat black ink, were 2 words. "Tonight." Jim stiffened, peering over Walt's shoulder. "What the hell is this?" The man folded the paper back up, calm as ever. "A promise," he said, "and a warning." Walt's fists clenched, his heartbeat slow and steady. "You sending more bikers to die?" The man chuckled again, shaking his head. "No, Mr. Reynolds, tonight we won't be sending bikers." His smile faded. "We'll be sending professionals." The silence that followed was thick. Walt's body didn't tense, didn't flinch, but inside, his mind was working fast. This wasn't Havoc. This wasn't just a gang. This was something bigger, something worse. Jim shifted beside him. "You mean hired guns?" The man nodded. "Call them what you want, but they don't come for fights, Mr. Reynolds." He stepped closer, his dark eyes locked on Walt's. "They come to end things." Walt didn't blink, didn't back down. Instead, he nodded. "Good," he said. The man raised an eyebrow. Walt stepped forward, his voice low, even. "Because if they're professionals—" He let the words hang. Then a small, sharp smile. "Then they already know what happens to a man when he underestimates his enemy." The man studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled, stepping back. "Well then," he murmured, "this should be interesting." He turned, walked back to the truck, paused. One hand on the door, he glanced back. "See you tonight, Mr. Reynolds." Then he was gone. The truck rumbled away, disappearing into the morning mist. And for the first time in his life, Jim looked nervous. He turned to Walt. "Tell me you got a plan for this?" he muttered. Walt stared after the truck, his jaw tight. Then he turned, stepping back into the alley, toward the men waiting for him. "We make a stand," he said. "And we make sure tonight is the night they regret ever coming to Brookdale. Because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about finishing the fight before it even started. Brookdale had faced trouble before, but this was something else. The Vipers were one thing, violent, Reckless, dangerous, sure, but predictable. Havoc was a bully, a thug with a gang at his back. He used fear and brute force because that's all he knew. But this new threat, the man in the suit, the promise of professionals coming tonight, that was different. That wasn't about control. That wasn't about intimidation. That was about elimination. And Walt Reynolds knew it. Back in the diner, the town had gathered. Not just the men, but everyone. The women, the teenagers, the business owners. Because this wasn't just a fight for territory anymore. This was about survival. Ryan, the mechanic, was pacing, his hands locked behind his head. "They're not just bringing bikers back, are they?" he muttered. "No," Jim said flatly. "They're bringing in killers." The room fell into thick silence. You could feel the shift, the realization of what that meant. The Vipers might have been dangerous, but they still had rules. Some kind of twisted code. But professionals, men who were paid to end things, no rules, no mercy, no hesitation. Tom Mason, the hardware store owner, cleared his throat. "So, what do we do?" Walt was quiet for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. Then he spoke. "We fight smarter." Jim frowned. "How the hell do you fight smarter against trained killers?" Walt met his eyes. "You make them come to you." Because that was the real mistake, not theirs. Theirs, the men coming tonight, they were used to hunting, used to stalking their target. What they weren't used to? Being the hunted. Walt knew something about men like that. They were tactical. They worked best when they had the advantage, when their enemy didn't know they were there. But what if they walked into a town where every single person was ready for them? Jim ran a hand through his hair. "So what's the plan?" Walt straightened. "Brookdale's about to disappear." The first step was making the town look abandoned. Streetlights, cut the power, businesses locked up tight, houses, windows boarded, doors bolted. From the outside, Brookdale needed to look like a place that had already been taken, a place not worth fighting for. Because men like this, they didn't come in guns blazing. They watched first. They scouted their targets. And what Walt wanted them to see was a ghost town, a place ripe for the taking. But behind those locked doors, behind those darkened windows, Brookdale was waiting. Every home had an armed lookout. Every business had an escape route and a fallback point. Every alley, every rooftop, every blind spot. Someone was watching, because when the enemy came, Brookdale wouldn't be standing in the open, waiting to be picked off. Brookdale would be in the shadows, watching, waiting. It wasn't long before the first outsiders arrived. The kind of men who didn't belong in a small town like this. Dark SUVs, blackout windows. They didn't speed in like the Vipers. They rolled in quietly, like ghosts, moving slow, watching, searching. From the rooftop of the gas station, Ryan had a rifle in his hands, his eyes locked on the street below. 3 SUVs so far, he whispered into his radio. They're not getting out yet, just circling. Let them, Walt's voice crackled through the line, because he knew what they were doing. They were looking for movement, looking for signs of life, looking for the first idiot to peek out from behind a curtain and give away their position. And Brookdale didn't take the bait. Not a single door opened, not a single light flickered on. The town remained still, silent, empty, the way Walt wanted it. Inside the diner, Jim was at the radio, listening in. "They're getting impatient," Ryan whispered. One of them just stepped out, taking a smoke. "Keep eyes on him," Walt replied. "Think they'll leave if they don't see anything?" Jim muttered. "No," Walt said. "They're just waiting for dark." And they were, because the real attack? It wouldn't come in broad daylight. It would come in the dead of night, when their enemy thought Brookdale was asleep, when they thought the town was vulnerable. But Brookdale wouldn't be sleeping. Brookdale would be watching. Brookdale would be ready. By 10 p.m. the streets were pitch black. The SUVs were parked now, their engines off, their men waiting in the shadows, waiting for the moment they could move unseen. Then, At exactly 10:37 p.m., they made their move. 5 men, moving silently, slipped from the vehicles. Dark clothes, tactical gear, silenced weapons, ghosts in the night. They fanned out, 1 toward the gas station, 2 toward the residential district, 2 toward Walt's house, just like the note had promised. Tonight, they thought they were the predators, but what they didn't realize was Brookdale had already set the trap. The first man, the one creeping toward the gas station. He never saw the tripwire until it was too late. Snap, a flurry of noise, and suddenly a metal bear trap snapped shut on his ankle, crushing bone and muscle in an instant. His muffled scream barely made it past his lips before a boot stomped on his throat, cutting him off. Ryan knelt beside him, pressing the barrel of a pistol to his forehead. "Welcome to Brookdale," he muttered. The 2 heading toward the residential district had it worse. They slipped into an alley, moving low. But the shadows moved with them. From above, 2 figures dropped down, striking hard and fast. One took a rifle butt to the head, out cold before he even hit the ground. The other, he barely had time to draw his weapon before a steel pipe cracked against his wrist, sending his gun skittering across the pavement. A heavy boot slammed into his ribs, knocking him flat. A voice, low and steady, whispered in his ear, "We ain't the ones afraid tonight." The last 2, they made it all the way to Walt's front porch, and that's when they realized they weren't hunting. They were surrounded. The shadows moved, and suddenly 10 rifles were pointed at their backs. Walt stepped forward, slow, steady, chain wrapped around his fist. "You should have left well enough alone," he said. And then Brookdale struck, and the night belonged to them. The moment Brookdale struck, the professionals realized their mistake. They had come expecting a soft target, a small town filled with farmers, store owners, and old men trying to hold on to a past that had already left them behind. But what they had walked into? A trap, a battlefield where they weren't the hunters. They were the hunted. The first takedown happened fast. The 2 men who had reached Walt's house thought they were being careful. They moved with silent precision, their boots barely making a sound on the wooden porch, their weapons drawn and ready. But they had no idea they were being watched. No idea that inside the house, behind those darkened windows, 6 armed men were waiting for them to step through the front door. No idea that from the rooftops, Walt's sharpshooters had them dead in their sights. And when Walt stepped out of the shadows, his boots hitting the porch with purpose, the 2 men barely had time to turn their heads before the world exploded around them. A flashbang detonated in the street, filling the air with white-hot light, and a sound like a bomb going off in their skulls. One of them stumbled back, hand flying up to his ear, gun wavering. The other, he had just enough time to blink the blinding light away before the cold steel of a rifle barrel pressed against the back of his skull. "Drop it," Walt said, his voice calm and deadly. The man hesitated, and that was his second mistake. The first was coming here at all. Across town in the residential district it was the same story. The 2 men who had been sent to clear out any survivors, to make sure no one was left alive to tell the tale, never even made it past the first alley, because Brookdale's defenders were already there. One of them moved like a shadow, slipping through the dark alleys, circling behind his target. The other waited, crouched low behind an old pickup truck, watching as the men came closer, waiting for them to make one wrong move. And when the first gunman took a step into the alley, when he paused for just a second too long, a heavy bat swung from the darkness, hitting his ribs so hard it cracked 3 of them on impact. The man gasped, dropping his weapon, his body folding inward from the pain. And the second one? Before he could even register what had happened, before he could reach for his sidearm, a figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Cold steel pressed against his throat. A voice whispered in his ear, "Don't move!" He froze, because he knew that if he did, that knife would be inside him before he could even take a breath. The gas station was the next battlefield. Ryan had been watching from the rooftop, rifle steady, scope locked on the third group. the one headed toward the fuel depot. And that's when he saw what they were trying to do. They weren't here to take over. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to burn it all down. One of them was carrying a duffel bag, and Ryan could see the Molotov cocktails inside, glass bottles, cloth wicks, enough fuel to turn half of Brookdale into an inferno. His jaw tightened, and in that moment he made his decision. Ryan exhaled slowly, finger on the trigger, lined up the shot, and pulled it. The bullet tore through the silence, hitting the first man in the shoulder, spinning him around before he crashed to the pavement. The duffel bag hit the ground, bottles shattering on impact, gasoline spilling onto the street. The second man barely had time to react before Ryan cycled the bolt, found his target, and fired again. This shot hit the guy in the leg, sending him collapsing against the gas pumps. And the third? He had just enough time to look up, to see the rooftop where the shots had come from, before the butt of a shotgun slammed into his jaw, knocking him unconscious. Jim stood over him, breathing heavy, reloading his weapon. And Ryan? Ryan was already lining up his next shot. By the time the last professional hit the ground, Brookdale was still standing. Not a single house had been breached. Not a single business had been burned. The mercenaries, the ones who had come to wipe this town off the map, were on the ground, bleeding, unconscious, or dead. And Brookdale? Brookdale had won. Walt stood in the center of Main Street, looking around at what his town had just survived. The bodies, the weapons, the men who had been so sure of their victory, now lying in the dirt. Jim walked up beside him, shotgun still in hand. "That all of them?" Walt nodded. "Yeah." Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered. "What do we do with them?" Because now Brookdale had a decision to make. They could turn them over to the authorities, or they could send a message, one that Havoc and anyone else who thought they could take this town would never forget. Walt exhaled, looking down at the leader of the mercenaries, the one who had spoken to him earlier that day. He was still alive, barely. Walt crouched beside him, his voice low and steady. "You came to wipe us out." The man groaned, his eyes blinking open, blood on his lips. Walt's expression didn't change. "But you forgot something." He leaned in closer. "This ain't your fight." The man tried to speak, but Walt just shook his head. "You tell whoever sent you," he continued, his voice deadly calm. "If they come back?" His grip tightened on the length of steel chain wrapped around his fist. "They won't be leaving in one piece." Brookdale wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fortress. And anyone who came after it again wouldn't live to tell the tale. Brookdale had drawn a line in the sand, and when the dust settled, that line was still there. The professionals, the men who had come to erase the town from existence, had been taken apart, piece by piece. They had come expecting an easy job. What they had found instead, a town that didn't run, a town that hit back. Now, Brookdale wasn't just standing. Brookdale was watching, because they knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Not until Havoc himself was put in the ground. Jim sat outside the gas station, shotgun across his lap, watching the road. The air was quiet. Too quiet. Ryan was next to him, smoking a cigarette. "You think we bought ourselves some time?" Ryan muttered. Jim exhaled, shaking his head. "Not a chance." Ryan flicked the cigarette into the dirt, crushing it under his boot. "Yeah," he muttered. "Didn't think so." Walt stood outside his house, arms crossed, watching the sunrise. The bodies of the professionals had been dealt with. The ones who had survived had been sent back. A message to whoever had hired them. A message that said, "Brookdale isn't yours. It never was. It never will be." The town had gathered in the diner, the tension thick, because now came the hard part, deciding what happened next. "We should be on the offensive," Ryan said, leaning forward. "We should take the fight to Havoc before he tries this again." Tom Mason shook his head. "We're not mercenaries," he muttered. "We're defending our home. We're not supposed to be the ones attacking." Ryan scoffed. "You think he's just gonna back off?" "Of course not," Jim said. but running into a trap isn't the answer either. Everyone looked at Walt, because when it came down to it, he was the one they trusted to make the call. Walt took a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the table. Then he spoke. "We're not waiting," he said. Ryan nodded, satisfied. "We taking the fight to him?" "No," Walt muttered. "We're making him come to us. Again." Jim frowned. Why the hell would he do that? Walt leaned forward, his voice steady. "Because we're going to make sure he's got no other choice." There was a difference between a biker gang and a military unit, a difference between men who rode for power and men who rode because they had nothing left to lose. Havoc's crew had always relied on fear, chaos, and overwhelming numbers. Brookdale had something else, a strategy, and this time, they were going to make sure Havoc walked into a war he couldn't win. The plan started that night. Brookdale had men who knew the back roads better than any GPS ever could. Men who knew where the Vipers kept their supply chains, their safe houses, and their cash spots. And one by one, they started cutting them off. A gas station outside town, burned to the ground. A warehouse filled with stolen bikes and weapons, emptied. A supply truck moving up the highway meant to restock the Vipers' clubhouse, never made it there. Because Brookdale wasn't just sitting and waiting, Brookdale was starving them out. By the third night, Havoc was starting to feel the pressure. His operation, one that had been built on control, fear, and domination, was falling apart. "You want to explain to me," he growled, pacing back and forth in his warehouse, "how a bunch of farmers and old war vets are running circles around us?" The men in the room shifted uncomfortably. Because the truth? None of them had an answer. None of them had ever seen anything like this before. This wasn't a town running scared. This wasn't a town waiting to be conquered. This was a town that had just taken out a group of hired professionals, and now they were hunting the hunters. And for the first time, Havoc felt something he wasn't used to. Doubt. It was the fourth night when he made his decision. He had to end this, not with a slow, careful approach, not with more outside help. He had to do it himself. He had to ride into Brookdale one last time and burn it down himself. Brookdale was ready for him. Because they knew this was how it would end. Not with hired guns, not with outsiders, but with Havoc himself walking straight into their hands. The night air was heavy. Every street in Brookdale was quiet. But inside those houses, inside those buildings, the town was waiting. Every window had eyes behind it. Every alley had a rifle ready. Every rooftop had a lookout. And when Havoc finally rolled in, it would be the last mistake he ever made. The sound came first. The low, rolling thunder of motorcycles cutting through the silence. They weren't speeding in like before. They were taking their time, moving like predators. But Brookdale wasn't prey. Not anymore. Walt stood at the front of the diner, arms crossed, watching them come. Jim was beside him, shotgun loaded. Ryan was up on the roof, his rifle scope locked on the first rider in the convoy. And as the Black Vipers rolled onto Main Street, their headlights cutting through the darkness, Walt smiled slightly. Because this time, Brookdale wasn't the one walking into the trap. Havoc was. And by the time the sun came up, he wouldn't be leaving alive. The night was thick with the sound of approaching death. The Black Vipers rode in slow, their headlights cutting through the dark, engines growling like caged beasts. Walt stood still, his hands in his pockets, watching from the diner's front porch as Havoc led the charge. A full convoy of bikes, maybe 20, maybe 30, rolling in like they owned the place, like Brookdale was theirs to take. But Walt knew something Havoc didn't. Brookdale wasn't a prize to be stolen. It was a fortress. And tonight, that fortress was going to swallow the Vipers whole. The gang slowed as they reached the center of town. They were cautious now. Last time they had come in loud, arrogant, thinking they were unstoppable. And last time, they had gotten their asses handed to them. But tonight, they had something to prove. Havoc pulled up first, stopping in the middle of Main Street, right in front of the diner. The rest of his gang formed a loose circle around him, bikes idling, the air filling with the scent of gasoline and bad intentions. And then finally, Havoc stepped off his ride. He took off his helmet slowly, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "Well," he drawled, stretching his arms, "ain't this a sight?" Walt didn't say a word. He just watched, waiting. Havoc smirked. "No welcoming committee?" he said, spreading his arms. "No bullets? No traps?" His men chuckled, but it was forced, because even they could feel it. Something was wrong. Jim stood near the gas station, shotgun resting against his shoulder. Ryan was up on the hardware store roof, rifle locked on Havoc's head. And behind every window, in every alley, on every rooftop. Brookdale was watching, waiting. Havoc ran a hand through his messy black hair, tilting his head. "You gonna talk, Reynolds? Or just stare at me like some damn statue?" Still, Walt didn't answer, because he knew something Havoc didn't. He knew that the moment he opened his mouth, Havoc would think he had the upper hand. And Walt wasn't about to give him that. Not now, not ever. The silence stretched. The Vipers started to shift. They were waiting for something to happen. Waiting for an ambush. Waiting for a gunshot. But Brookdale didn't play by their rules. Brookdale made its own. Havoc exhaled hard, rolling his shoulders. "All right then," he muttered. "I'll start." His eyes locked onto Walt. "You took something from me, old man." Walt's eyebrow twitched. "Oh, yeah?" Havoc's smirk vanished. "You humiliated me," he growled. "Made me look weak." His fingers curled into fists. "You think I'm just gonna let that go?" Walt finally moved. Just a little. His hands came out of his pockets, his shoulders rolling back loose and easy. And then, in a voice as steady as stone, he said, "I don't think you got a choice." Havoc's nostrils flared. A ripple went through his men, like wolves sensing weakness, but Havoc didn't attack. Not yet, because Havoc wasn't dumb. He knew that Walt wasn't alone, that Brookdale wasn't some helpless town waiting to be taken, that every shadow was a potential threat. So he did something unexpected, something that made Jim stiffen across the street. He laughed, a full, loud, mocking laugh. Then he spread his arms again. "You know what, Reynolds?" he said, shaking his head. "I respect it." Jim's grip tightened on his shotgun. Ryan, from the rooftop, muttered, "This guy's playing a game." But Walt just watched. Havoc took a slow step forward. "You stood your ground," he said. "You fought back. That's rare. Most towns, they fold. But you—" His grin widened. "You're stubborn." He tilted his head. "So, let's settle it." Jim stiffened. "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered. Walt's face stayed blank. Havoc's grin turned dangerous. "One-on-one, Reynolds," he said. "You and me." He cracked his knuckles. "Winner takes Brookdale." The town went still. Jim muttered, "This son of a bitch." Ryan whispered into the radio, "Walt, don't you dare." But Walt wasn't listening. He was watching Havoc, watching the way he stood, the way his fingers twitched slightly, like he was itching for a fight. And Walt knew that no matter what he said, no matter what move he made, this was going to happen. So he made his decision, and it was the easiest one he'd made in years. "Fine." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. The town reacted instantly. Jim swore under his breath. Ryan tensed. The Vipers started grinning, and Havoc's grin turned into something twisted. "Good," he whispered. He rolled his shoulders. "Then let's get started." Walt cracked his knuckles. He hadn't been in a real fight in years, but that didn't mean he had forgotten how. Because fighting was like breathing. And tonight? Brookdale was about to watch an old man teach a lesson the Black Vipers would never forget. Havoc lunged first, fast, but Walt was faster. He sidestepped, twisting, and drove his fist into Havoc's ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. The crack echoed in the night. Havoc staggered back, eyes wide, gasping, and that's when he realized his mistake. He had expected a weak old man. What he got instead, a veteran, a man who had been fighting since before Havoc was born, and he was just getting started. Havoc recovered fast, snarling, came in swinging hard, trying to end it quick. But Walt wasn't just fighting, he was waiting, studying. And the moment Havoc left his ribs open again, Walt drove his knee straight into his gut, knocking the air from his lungs. Havoc collapsed onto one knee, gasping, and Walt stepped closer, voice low. "You don't run this town," he muttered. Havoc's head snapped up, rage in his eyes. "You son of a—" But before he could finish, Walt grabbed him by the collar and drove his fist straight into Havoc's face. The Vipers watched in silence. Brookdale watched in awe. Because when Havoc hit the dirt, bloody and barely conscious, everyone knew Brookdale had won. Havoc lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath his lip, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brookdale stood watching. The town had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the man who had terrorized them, threatened them, tried to break them, to finally fall. And now, here he was, beaten, broken, done. Jim exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Well, I'll be damned." Ryan, from the rooftop, let out a low whistle. Didn't think the old man still had it in him. But Walt? Walt wasn't celebrating, not yet, because he knew something the rest of them didn't. This wasn't over, not yet. Havoc groaned, rolling onto his side, spitting blood onto the pavement. His gang, the Black Vipers, watched in stunned silence. They had never seen their leader like this, had never seen him lose. And now, some of them were shifting, exchanging glances, like they were suddenly re-evaluating everything they believed in. Havoc wiped his mouth, his breath ragged. Then he laughed, a low, bitter chuckle. "You think this changes anything?" he muttered. His fingers twitched toward his boot, toward the knife hidden there, but before he could even grab it, Walt was already moving. His boot came down hard on Havoc's wrist, pinning it to the pavement. Havoc hissed in pain, looking up. And Walt? He just stared down at him. "You lost." His voice was calm, deadly. "Take your boys and get out of my town." For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, one of the Black Vipers stepped forward. "Boss!" Havoc's eyes snapped to him. The man hesitated. Then he shook his head. "This ain't worth it." A ripple went through the gang, because suddenly the Vipers weren't just looking at Walt anymore. They were looking at each other and realizing Havoc wasn't the man they thought he was. Another Viper stepped back, then another. Then one of them took off his jacket, the one with the Viper's patch on it, and dropped it to the ground. Havoc watched, speechless, as more and more of his men did the same. One by one, they turned away from him, because a gang built on fear would only last as long as that fear held power. And tonight, that fear was gone. Jim smirked. "Looks like you got yourself a mutiny." Havoc clenched his jaw, his fists trembling. "You cowards," he spat. "You think you can just walk away?" No one answered, because they didn't have to. They already had. Ryan exhaled. "So, what do we do with him?" Everyone looked at Walt. The old man stared down at Havoc for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "Let him go." Jim's brow furrowed. "Seriously?" Walt nodded. "He's got nothing left." And that was a fate worse than death. Havoc scrambled to his feet, wild-eyed and furious, but there was no fight left in him. No gang to back him up, no one to run to. For the first time in his miserable life, he was alone, and as he stumbled away, disappearing into the darkness, Brookdale stood tall. The town had won. But more importantly, they had survived. Not just the fight, not just the battle, but the fear. Because now they knew. Brookdale wasn't just a small town. Brookdale wasn't just a place on a map. Brookdale was a family, And as long as they had each other, as long as they stood together, no one could ever take that away. Jim sighed, shaking his head. Didn't think it'd end like this. Ryan smirked. Yeah, he muttered. Me neither. Then, after a moment, he glanced at Walt. So what now, old man? Walt looked at his town, at the people who had fought beside him, at the streets that had almost been lost. And then he smiled. We rebuild. Brookdale would never be the same, because that night it had changed forever. It wasn't a town of victims anymore. It wasn't a town waiting to be saved. It was a town that had saved itself. And that was the most powerful thing of all, because in the end, strength isn't just about winning fights, it's about knowing what's worth fighting for. And Brookdale had learned that lesson better than anyone. So to anyone out there, anyone who's ever been told they're not strong enough, not tough enough, not good enough, just remember this: true strength, it doesn't come from power, it doesn't come from fear, it comes from standing together, from never backing down, from believing that no matter how bad things get, there is always a way to fight back. And that's the kind of strength nobody can take away.